deep reserves, Australia has become a global player.
French fury against the federal government shows no sign of easing, breaking a $90 billion submarine contract.
In about a year from now, we'll have so much critical mineral and rare earths that you won't know what to do with them.
That is in the globe's interest.
But there's just one problem.
China controls the market.
Make no mistake, this is China versus the world.
China and the United States, two of the most powerful nations in the world, and Australia is caught between them whilst we could be one of the wealthiest nations on earth. The question isn't whether we're dependent. We know we're dependent. The question is how much and what an invasion would actually look like, what our relationship with the US realistically is, and what does the true motives of our allies actually look like when pressure is applied. So let's get into it. All right, guys, let's just lay out one example of how China could actually just invade Australia, because I feel like there's just a lot of misconceptions around China bringing their big naval fleet and, air force and just invade Australia and take over in a day. So there's a lot of misconceptions around it. So let's just lay out one. And just an FYI, I'm definitely not a war expert by any means. I'm just an Australian looking at, what a possibility could be and just having a conversation with you guys. So let me know your comments down below. I've just done some research, just saying my opinion. Definitely not a war expert, just an FYI. Okay, so China's mainland, let's say to Sydney, is roughly 7,000 km. For reference, that's basically London to Mumbai. Mainland China to Darwin is roughly 4,000 km. Obviously, you cannot make the trip without refueling. Their main bomber, the H-6K, has a combat radius of around 3,500 kilometers before it needs gas. So that's directly not making it to Australia. However, this is where people will jump in and say, our distance is our natural deterrent, which is it's incorrect, absolutely incorrect. It just makes it slightly more difficult for China. It's still very much doable. They just need, allies or coerced allies. And looking at their options, I think their best one would be Indonesia, but based on an educated guess, I reckon Indonesia would probably try and stay neutral as they rely on China for their economy and also want to align with Australia for security in Indo-Pacific. But then we've got to look into Cambodia. The PLA basically has the Ream naval base, allowing strategic, positioning in Southeast Asia and closer access to Australia by refueling aircraft or warships. Also, they have dual-use assets in Vanuatu and Kiribati, and more closer to home, the Solomon Islands, which we said in our last video in this series, in 2022, China signed a security pact for the Solomon Islands. Whilst they were denying, any military bases, the agreement does allow Chinese naval, vessels to dock, replenish, and, utilize local logistics. So that's a bit threatening. And also an FYI, the Solomon Islands just sit, 2,000 km off Australia's eastern coast. So they've been establishing their Silk Road, which is also in Australia. Like we mentioned in our first episode in this series, Port Darwin is owned by a Chinese company with, potential ties to the CCP. Therefore, the Silk Road plan kind of destroys this whole protection of the ocean that Australia sometimes, says we have. And also, just summarized, yes, the majority of China's major aircraft cannot make it to Australia from the mainland. And the little that can would be so few that they'll land in Darwin and most likely be met with us and 2,500 US Marines that would probably just wipe them out. However, using strategic bases closer to Australia, creating a bit of a layered grid and the ability to use standoff cruise missiles, that's one aspect of a larger scenario of how China would try to invade Australia. And whilst China has some ballistic missile range to Australia from their mainlands, I think standoff cruise missiles present a completely different story and a much more strategic scenario, as ballistic missiles would mean absolute destruction, whereas short-range missiles allow for precise, conventional strikes as well as negotiation factors and choke points in shipping lanes. Also, looking at all of this, that could be one possibility for a land invasion. However, we got to remember that regional isolation tactics would destroy us from the inside and potentially could be how modern warfare is actually fought. And just to be clear, yet again, I'm not saying this is exactly how China would invade Australia, all right? I'm just simply looking at one possible scenario because like I said, there's a lot of misconception out there, like the ocean that will fully protect us, or that an invasion will just be a large-scale naval and air assault that'll be over in like a couple of days, which I think is a huge misconception, which we just debunked. Also, I'm not trying to be a war expert by any means. Good gosh, I'm definitely not. Just an Australian trying to figure out what our realistic position is. Now, China built fast in the early 2000s, and in my opinion, our critical minerals built modern China, whilst yes, it boosted our economy, and this is where we cut through the BS, and this was a beneficial relationship, okay? But it was a stupid one. Why would we be sitting on the wealthiest minerals, export to China to build, when we could have used them to be self-sufficient? Ridiculous. However, China did build itself up through our critical minerals. Lithium, we export 97% of our raw lithium ore to China. They create phones, EV batteries, grid energy, storage systems, and then we buy it back from them. Okay, that's great. Another example, rare earth elements. China controls over 90% of global rare earth separation capacity, and then creates defense technology. Those two exports generating us billions. But this has been happening for well over, 20 years? And this has destroyed our sovereignty and has made us be at the whim of China, who is playing ball with Africa to ditch us. So the Australian government chose to make a quick buck and leave us with the dependency, which, for example, I think it led to the early 2000s and 2010s experiencing the Dutch disease, because Chinese purchasers were buying up all of our iron ore and coal. So whilst it's a dependency, it's negatively affecting us, which leads to what China is doing in Africa. And I promise you guys, this is going somewhere. It definitely ties back to us, okay? So just stay with me on this. Zimbabwe has become one of the biggest lithium producing countries on the planet, basically overnight. It's becoming the 4th largest lithium producer on the planet. But guys, who owns the mines? Who owns the factories that turn that lithium into something usable? China. Almost entirely China. There are 7 major lithium operations in Zimbabwe, and they're overwhelmingly Chinese owned. So China is basically Zimbabwe's lithium industry at this point. And this is how it works, guys. Stage 1, back when Chinese companies first moved in, they spent billions buying up these mines. They built what is called concentrator plants. All these plants do is take raw rock out of the ground, crush it into powder, about 6% lithium. Basic stuff. Then step 1 of the process. There are 6 of these plants running right now. All Chinese owned. Stage 2, which is basically what you're thinking right now, right? And I thought this too when I was researching. I was like, Zimbabwe still has a government though. Yes, they're, a third world sort of country. However, surely they would have done something to show they're protecting sovereignty. Well, they sort of did, all right? Zimbabwe actually passed a law banning the export of that raw powder. They said, nah, you have to process it here further in our country before it leaves. But there's obviously a pretty clear loophole here, because guess who immediately stepped up to build the next level of factories? The advanced, chemical refineries that turn that powder into lithium sulfate and lithium carbonate, which is the actual stuff that goes straight into battery manufacturing. You guessed it, China again. So Zimbabwe banned exporting raw powder. So China just said, all right, let's play. And they just built the refining facilities in Zimbabwe to export the valuable shit back to China. Nuts. Now, there's a $400 million plant at the Arcadia mine already shipped Africa's first ever export of lithium sulfate. There's a $500 million plant at Bicata, and there's a third one under construction right now at Kimativi, and there's already talk of a 4th, and even higher end lithium carbonate plant going on top of that. So let's just be really clear about what's actually happening here. The entire supply chain is on someone else's continent, feeding straight back to Beijing. Now, how does this have anything to do with Australia? It does, because Australia has spent the last 20 years telling itself, we have the critical minerals China needs, and that gives us leverage. Then we just propped up the economy on that. But what China just showed the world is what they are doing in Zimbabwe. Is exactly what they do when they want to reduce dependency on a country. By using a third world country to bypass, some of the nonsense of the West, lessening China's dependency on us and severing sort of that restraint by China. So whilst Australia manages dependency, in my opinion, China is getting ready to drop us as soon as they can by outsourcing to Zimbabwe and other nations. Okay, guys, we basically just laid out that China sort of exploited our minerals for 20 plus years and is now outsourcing to Zimbabwe to lessen their dependency on us, leading to Australia, getting what we sort of deserve, being a globalist nation for so long. Ridiculous. But here's where it gets truly uncomfortable, because every time an Australian hears that, their gut reaction is, well, we've got America. And don't get me wrong, my first reaction goes there as well. Our big brother America will come to our rescue, because we've been told that for so long. And it's sort of our last hope. Something goes wrong and we just pray that the US backs us. But guys, we live in reality over here. And if we're going to hang our hat on that reliance, whilst hopefully making changes to become sovereign, we actually have to look into if America sees it the same way as us. And a bit of a spoiler alert here, guys, why would they want to? Now, let's just do a quick overview of what has actually happened with this AUKUS deal. And I know you guys probably already know a lot of the events that have happened throughout this deal. So if you do, just skip a little ahead. But I always like to lay out the groundwork first, because one thing that I absolutely hate is when I'm watching a video and people just start talking about an event or a deal without explaining what it is. I'm like, I really want to hear your perspective on this, but I also don't know enough about this deal to follow what you're saying. So let's just quickly go over the key points. And remember, this isn't everything. These are just the key things that have happened. So we've got to go back to September the 15th, 2021. ScoMo, Boris Johnson, Joe Biden jumped on a surprise virtual press conference and announced AUKUS to the world. There was no public debate around this. There was no parliamentary vote. And I think the most important, there was no consultation with the Australian people. Australia torched an existing $90 billion submarine contract with France because France was originally providing Australia under the 2016 contract with 12 attack class submarines, which were diesel electric submarines. That's important. Australia went with this option because we didn't want to violate nuclear proliferation rules at the time. However, the US had for decades strictly guarded its naval nuclear secrets, sharing them only once in history with the United Kingdom, back in 1958. Then in 2021, the US and the UK made a highly classified and sort of completely unexpected offer to share this known as, crown jewel technology with Australia, which would become the AUKUS pack. And obviously, nuclear submarines are much better than diesel electric submarines. Some key things: they can save submerged for almost indefinitely, they can travel much faster, they can operate at unmatched stealth for extended periods of time. So, bit of a long story short here. From a national security perspective, the American and UK deal was simply better than the French deal. However, this happened overnight. France was so furious it recalled its ambassadors from both Washington and Canberra. It's the first time it's ever done that, with the French foreign minister calling it a stab in the back. Australia also agreed to pay France a whopping 555 million euros, which equates to AUD 830 mil. And that was a penalty for walking out of the deal. So on day one of AUKUS, we blew up a long-standing alliance relationship, paid over $500 million in exit fees. Then we need to go to 2023. God, lots happened so far. 2023, okay? The price announcement. We finally get the details. The total cost is between $268 billion and $368 billion over 30 years. Some defense analysis thinks that the real number, when you account for blowouts, which in my opinion always happens, be realistic here, well, they say it could be triple that. So potentially $1 trillion for a country of nearly 28 million people. 2 years later, 2025, we get tariffed. Australia made its first payment to the United States under AUKUS, $500 million USD, and that wasn't for a submarine. It was to fix American shipyards. Trump has also slapped 25% tariff on Australian steel and aluminium, which we have just paid hundreds of millions of dollars to them, not even for subs yet, just to repair American shipping yards to build the subs that Australia is buying from them, and we just got taxed for it. Basically did. And what was Albanese's response? He called Trump and basically begged for an exemption. Well, that failed because America is America first, right? And adding to 2025, we had a review. Mid-2025, Trump's administration launched a formal review of AUKUS to decide if it aligned with the president's America First agenda. The man put in charge of that review had already said publicly, my concerns is why are we giving away this crown jewel asset when we most need it? That's the guy auditing whether we get our submarines. And whilst that review was actively underway, Australia made a second payment, another $525 million into the same deal being reviewed for potential cancellation. What the actual fuck? Then in 2026, quite recently, we ended up with secondhand subs. We started this deal expecting brand new Virginia-class submarines. The AUKUS partners just revised the plan, removing the only new built Virginia-class submarine previously expected for the Australian Royal Navy and replacing it with a third boat drawn from existing US Navy fleet. So used submarines pulled from active American service after we paid $1 billion. Like, what planet are we on right now? So to put it plainly, we cancelled a $90 billion French contract and paid $583 million in penalties to walk away from it. We then committed potentially up to $1 trillion to a new deal. And we've been paying hundreds of millions into American shipyards. That part is not for submarines, just to fix their production lines for Australia to then pay the US to build the submarines. And the Americans launched a review to decide if the deal even suited them. The man running that review basically said, in my opinion, paraphrasing here, but he basically said it would be crazy if we kept paying them anyway. So we got tariffed whilst writing the checks. We couldn't retaliate. And after all of that, after all of the payments, all of the treaties, all of the political capital, we ended up with secondhand submarines pulled from existing US fleet. Great. That's what we get for operating as a globalist nation for decades. And that is why national sovereignty is so important. We basically are paying America to repair their own shipyards and paying them again to build the ships that we want. Yes, this is because they have access to nuclear-powered submarines and are facilitating that to us under their guidelines. However, that doesn't completely solve the problem here. Because why can't we act like as a stronger force? Why can't we be taken seriously? Why can't we present ourselves as a stronger front when the US wants to review a deal that we've already been paying hundreds of millions of dollars into? Like, the way America treats Australia right now in this AUKUS deal really shows where Australia is at globally. Now, we've laid out everything, and I'm definitely saying, we're dependent on the US, so we simply get pushed around. Richard Marles said last year regarding the subs review that it was perfectly natural and understandable for the new administration to look under the hood for the new submarine pact. I understand a new administration reviewing deals, but a Pentagon official also said that they want to make sure the plan aligns with Trump's America First agenda. Okay, but this deal has been in play for years. Australia has already spent millions into it, and that right there just begs the question. If Trump saw this deal as not aligned with putting America first, would the US just lessen its support to Australia? Like, this isn't how international politics and domestic survival should be ran. Australia should be a respected country. And I think it's just obviously dangerous and stupid to have Australia so dependent that a sentence from the US could just completely change how we view our domestic protections. And also, remember, we have the US embedded throughout our entire country, and we still can't say anything? It's nuts. So we've been paying billions into US shipyards. We've signed a 30-year, potentially $1 trillion commitment. We can't criticize our president. Our boat won't impose retaliatory tariffs. And we can't question their use of our land for their intelligence, leading to risks in potential war. I'm citing Pine Gap here. And if they decide that the deal doesn't suit an America First agenda, they can just walk. The AUKUS agreement already contains clauses that the US could potentially cancel the pact. And, we could potentially cancel as well, but why would we? We've already prepaid. Now, you get people saying, let's leave the US. The lefties always go at it saying, I don't like Trump, like he's becoming a king in America, let's leave the United States. But we simply can't. We are way too dependent on the US, and therefore we're getting a shitty deal in return. We can't say anything about it because if we leave the AUKUS deal, or if we sever ties with the United States, or say the wrong thing to Trump, our defense would absolutely collapse. So we are forced to put up with this shitty deal, then we're not getting out of this, as in our dependency, unless we right now start prioritizing our national sovereignty and actually prioritize our national sovereignty to build up our independence. Otherwise, as Paul Keating says, we will become the 51st state of America. And one more example, guys, that shows that the US is way more than just involved in our defense. So when Trump announced his tariff package on Australia, a minimum 10% tariff on Australian imports, with steel and aluminium getting hit with 50% tariffs, one of the reasons that he gave was beef. He basically said, Australia won't take our beef, but we imported $3 billion worth of Australian beef from them last year. Now, that's not completely true. Okay, Australia technically started allowing limited amounts of American beef back in 2019. But jumping to the reality, the US processes cattle from places like Mexico and Canada, and we have some of the strictest biosecurity law requirements around mad cow disease, which makes it very difficult for most American beef to get into our country. So Trump's statements were very direct and sort of kind of not true. But of course, almost immediately after Trump complained about it and threatened tariffs, Australia quietly dropped those biosecurity restrictions. Of course we did. Now, the Albanese government says that this was a result of a 10-year independent scientific review that just happened to finish at the exact same time. Now, you guys can make up your own mind on that, but I definitely know what I'm thinking. The Trump administration and the coalition both looked at the time and basically said, like, come on, this looks like political coercion. And even David Littlebrow called it out, and he said that he wanted to see the science behind the decision and that he was suspicious about how quickly it happened. So either way, the point is that Trump complains, Australia's changed some of the strictest rules that we have, and Australian farmers are now competing against American beef on their own shelves. Okay, so I think we've very much established that we are dependent, and a perfect example of how the United States really sees us is the Kevin Rudd incident. Now, in 2025, Trump showed up to the White House with Albanese in October. Trump admitted regarding AUKUS that it was made a while ago and nobody did anything about it, and assured us that we're starting the process now. Now, side note, that's nuts. Like we've said before, Australia has committed up to Australian dollars to this deal, and then the Kevin Rudd incident happened. A reporter raised Rudd's past comments about Trump, which included calling him a village idiot and a political liability and a traitor to the West, and Trump directly looked at Rudd and said, I don't like you either, and I probably never will. Albo laughed it off and later called it banter. Bullshit. Our Prime Minister sitting in the most important bilateral meeting Australia has had in years, a meeting he reportedly waited 10 months to get. And when the US President publicly humiliates our ambassador to his face, the responses from Canberra is, oh, it's a bit of a chuckle and they called it banter. And then Rudd eventually sat down. So I think that's a perfect example of how the US actually sees Australia. Now, I'm not saying that America is our enemy. What I'm saying is that we have to look into the incentives of our nation for America's vulnerabilities, which I would think disregards the friendships depending on how much the need is. Now, Australia is sitting on something that both superpowers, China and America, desperately needs: critical minerals and refining. America's problem isn't that they don't have the minerals in the ground. Their problem is that they can't refine them. China controls roughly 90% of the world's rare earth processing capability, and America has very little refining capacity by comparison. And China is now going to step further by banning the export of rare earth processing technology itself. So even if America wanted to rapidly build refineries, they're basically locked out. And that's the problem, because America is preparing for the possibility of a conflict with China, while a lot of the materials needed to fight that conflict are controlled by China. So we're talking about the materials that go into everything from phones to F-35 fighter jets. The chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee said that China's export threats alone could have brought America's defense manufacturing to its knees. So it looks like America is a little bit compromised there. Now, Australia. We supply 36 out of the 50 minerals on America's critical minerals list, and we are actively mining 29 of them right now. So more than 2/3 of the minerals America says it critically needs, we have them. And in Australia, you know, on the right, we always are saying, build more refineries, mine, extract, become self-sufficient. And whilst we have a long way to go and a lot more progress to be made to be fully self-sufficient and fulfill our true potential, we are doing something. You know, we are actually building our refinery infrastructure that America doesn't have. And right now, there is a refinery being built in Western Australia that will produce the exact materials needed for F-35's missile systems, drone technology. And when it's finished, which is projected to be done by 2027, it'll be one of the only facilities outside of China capable of doing it. Then on top of this, in 2025, Lynas became the first company outside of China to produce commercial quantities of dysprosium oxide. An Australian company achieved something that America still hasn't. So Australia has the minerals, Australia has been building the refineries, and Australia is already one of America's most important partners when it comes to breaking China's dominance over rare earth minerals. Now, here's the point I'm trying to get into. In a real conflict between the United States and China, where rare earths decide whether that F-35 flies or doesn't, when our refineries are the last ones standing outside Chinese control, does America treat Australia as a sovereign nation or an equal ally? Or do the Marines in Darwin and the base in our outback and the non-binding minerals deals and the submarine treaty we can't strategically exit, does that tell you everything that you need to know about how the conversation would actually go? And when I started looking into this, I went back throughout history to see if there were any similar situations and what was the outcome, right? And I found pretty clear indications. When critical resources become essential to winning wars, countries will do whatever they can and whatever is necessary to secure them. Obviously, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor partly because of oil supply concerns. Desert Storm was fought in part to stop one country controlling a huge share of the world's oil. During the Cold War, the CIA secretly bought titanium from the Soviet Union through front companies for the S-771 spy plane. So there are plenty of historical, precedent for countries going to extraordinary lengths to secure strategic resources. And America has already shown us how the relationship works. So if China cuts off rare earth exports the moment a conflict starts and America's defense manufacturing is running on fumes, does America politely ask for Australia's access to one of the major Western refinery hubs capable of keeping their F-35s flying? Or does the fact that they already have Pine Gap and, like we said, Marines and Darwin's and a submarine agreement, that we can't easily walk away from, and decades of strategic integration mean that the asking has already been done and the answer's already assumed? And it's not just America. China wants the same thing. They've spent decades buying our raw materials. They've built influence throughout the region. They've got a security pact with the Solomon Islands and increasing military reach across the Indo-Pacific. So if a conflict happens, one of the most resource-rich and strategically important countries in the region is Australia. So think about where that leaves us. 2 superpowers, 1 potential conflict, and both needing what's in our ground. So one has a non-binding handshake deal with us. The other has spent years building influence and strategic positioning throughout our region. And we would like to think of ourselves as a strategic partner, but from their perspective, I think we may just be a bit of a prize. So guys, here's where we actually are. I've gone through a lot of information trying to spend 20 years turning our critical minerals into their military and economic power. They are now running the Zimbabwe play to cut us loose the moment they don't need us anymore. America is embedded throughout our entire country, our outbacks, our ports, our defense systems, holding a non-binding minerals deal in one hand and an America First agenda in the other. We've paid over $1 billion into their shipyards. We've absorbed their tariffs. We've laughed off the humiliation of our own ambassador. And we ended up with secondhand subs. One has a handshake deal with us. The other has spent a decade building a ring of strategic positioning around our region. And we sit in the middle, the wealthiest piece of real estate in the Indo-Pacific that could potentially have our ally exploit us. Now, it seems like we're in a pretty complicated relationship. And next time on the 11 Show, guys, we're getting into what could start World War III. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Thanks, guys.